Today's discussion is on looking at sector-wide transformation. And we have the pleasure of introducing John Legatt, who's the Head of Public Sector at Capgemini. My name is Dr. Kevin Argus, and I'm the Program Director of the MBA program. So welcome. Welcome, John. Perhaps you could introduce yourself.
Thank you very much. So John Legatt, as you said, I lead public sector for Capgemini. I've been in that role for about 12 months, but I've been in the industry working with public sector organisations for over 20 years, both in the UK, in Australia, in New Zealand and in Europe.
Fantastic. So to get the ball rolling, what do you see as some of the major problems being addressed in the sector?
So if I look at the emergency services sector, in particular within public services, what I see is similar problems trying to be solved by individual agencies. And in my mind, the time of individual agencies trying to solve a problem is gone. I think we're getting to a realm now where, not just in public sector, but also in private sector, where we need multiple agencies, multiple organizations need to come together in order to solve larger intractable problems. Good example of that was during the pandemic, which was an event that impacted everyone, but you saw police agencies, you saw health agencies, you saw transport agencies, you saw a lot of private sector agencies all coming together in order to try and solve that problems. And in my mind, as we face more and more intractable problems and as we face more and more digital disruptions from technology, I think the age where a single agency tries to address a problem on its own, because of the interdependencies that I see across multiple sectors, I think it's in that point that I see a convergence where organizations will come together in order to solve some of those problems.
And how would you speak to the awareness, say across sectors, of the need for this collaborative approach?
So I think the awareness is there. I think I'd make a distinction between awareness and willingness. So I think awareness of a need and awareness of the benefits of having that cross-sector collaboration in terms of buying power, reduction of costs, removing duplicate functions, trying to drive more efficiencies and value for money is understood conceptually. But when you actually get to the willingness around being able to implement some of those, that's where you face some of the challenges. You end up with organizational politics, interorganizational politics, personalities. And so culturally, and trying to shift people moving into that direction, I think is where I see some of the bigger complexities and probably the biggest impediments to be able to achieve some of those things. On top of that, I think in public sector in particular, I see the funding models as really being a barrier to this. If you think about budgets being allocated at an agency level, it's actually driving and entrenching some of that behavior. Whereas if you were able to have assigned budgets to solve problems and have multiple agencies then being able to draw down on some of those budgets, then I think you'd be able to see a lot more collaboration.
So part of the skill from yourself as a consultant is understanding that stakeholder alignment. So what are the drivers of willingness? In other words, what are people's priorities? What are they striving to achieve, and in what time frame? And being clear on those things so that there's an alignment.
There is. I think my starting point is always commonality of objective. So if you take the sector-wide transformation that's happening in emergency services of Victoria at the moment, that requires police, it requires ambulance, it requires all of the various fire services, it requires 000 Victoria that sort of binds all of that together. So if you're trying to drive all of that transformation, a lot of the conversations that I've had in that topic has been, well, are we really clear? Is everybody aligned on the outcome you're trying to generate? Because if you don't have that alignment at that senior level, and if there's misalignment at that perspective, then you end up in a place where everybody's going to be driving in different directions. So if you have commonality of objective and you have everybody that's rallied behind that, then that's a really, really strong starting point, especially when you've got the senior executives around that. Then for me, it's always then about, okay, so what does that look like for you? So if you have, we want to build a safer Victoria, What does that look like for police? What does that look like for fire? What does that look like for ambulance services? And starting to bring all of those together, you will automatically then start to build some alignment, and you focus on the areas of commonality. Some of my colleagues tend to try and focus on the areas of differences and tries to resolve those. I tend to really focus on what are the areas of commonality, because I think that's a really good starting point to bind people. And it's a better start for negotiation on the areas where you might not be aligned, to show, well, look, you've actually got this alignment in all of these areas. So how can you not be aligned on these other areas? And I think it just helps from a negotiation, from a progression perspective.
Most interesting. And what technologies do you see that clients in that sector are currently grappling with in terms of this transformation?
So there are two aspects to that. I think there's one which is some very basic digital transformation technologies. So making sure that you're moving to cloud, using some of the latest software, some of the more innovative software delivery models, software as a service, and some of the commercial benefits that come with that. So all of those things will be working through, do I have the latest CRM system, removing duplication, removing dependencies on legacy systems. That's one, and I think that's about, for me, setting the foundation around all of those technology. But the biggest one, without a doubt, is AI, and in particular, adaptive AI. So for me, if I look at the rest of the world is moving very, very quickly in that space. And I have a certain level of frustration in Australia and in the Australian government, because if you look at most of the government agencies at the moment, they actually have an embargo on using it. So what they're waiting to see is where the rest of the world is taking it. What are some of the pitfalls, so that they can try and avoid them, which I understand that from a risk perspective. But I think the overall impact of this is that you end up being left behind. So yes, you end up seeing case studies and use cases of what's worked well, but you're not really thinking about how, the likes of artificial intelligence, big data, all of those aspects really start to transform how you can deliver services, starts to provide much more efficient services and better outcomes for citizens. And my worry is that Australia will be left 5-6 years behind everyone else, which will ultimately impact citizens.
Interesting. So it sounds like the challenge is helping them to align with possibilities that manage their risk profile. And in the public sector, there's nuances around risk that are different from private sector. Private sector's got more return to stakeholder as an incentive. Public sector's probably got different risk profiles.
It does, and you have to be safe. And there are enough examples in the world where predictive analytics, in particular in its early days, were used in order to inform service delivery. And there were some fairly major issues with those, where reliance on historical data meant that biases in that historical data were then translated into the analytical models and were then entrenched in the way the services were delivered. So there are a lot of lessons to be learned around that. I think modern day artificial intelligence is going to be, yes, it's based on data, but the nature of it constantly evolving, being able to evolve itself, to learn itself, and to be able to be tweaked, will have much more power. And so for me, it's not about, can I remove all of the risk? It's how can I mitigate the risk by delivering things in piecemeal fashions? So if I can pick on one or two use cases, make sure that I deliver those safely, test those, and then build on that and gain momentum, that I think you can mitigate the risk through delivery. What it also means is you can build the capability within organizations and within government organizations to really rethink how services are delivered, which is at the heart of what digital transformation is about. Digital transformation is not about putting things online. It's about fundamentally changing how you operate, how you deliver services, how you interact with customers. And so for me, if you don't start to build that capability and start to build that momentum, you almost end up in a place where you're trying to mitigate that risk to zero, and the reality is you never will, because You're not building the experience. You're not building the lessons learned internally that are specific to Australia. And you then end up, I think, in a world where you are get left behind a little bit.
Most interesting. And what outcomes do you see the public, or in this case, public sector, are looking for, particularly in the context of emergency services?
So I think what I describe is much more responsiveness, and there's always the view around how do you become preventative rather than responsive. Now, if I sort of extend my emergency services, if you sort of bring in transport systems and main road systems within all of those, then you're able to broaden the ecosystem out, and you're starting to be, well, how can I use data? How can I use predictive models around certain accidents, around certain fires, around where are my hotspots? What can I do in real time in order to try and mitigate those through traffic warning, through changing traffic conditions and doing all of those things? So for me, it's about being responsive, making sure that how do I reduce the time to respond to an incident when it's happened, but how do I then be preventative? And then for me, it's then how do I bring in other agencies that help me to become much more preventative in that sense?
Interesting. And that really leads into the next question that I have quite neatly, which is, what does the ideal user experience journey look like? And I think you were heading in that direction in terms of what the transition might enable.
It is. So it's funny because there are a lot of agencies that are sort of grappling with this at the moment that want to know, well, if I'm a road user, what's my customer experience? If I'm consuming police services, what's my customer experience? For me, it all boils down back to basic principles. So not thinking about events, but thinking about life journeys. So if I'm a consumer of those services, it's not just about how do I interact, but how do I make sure that I've got the right data, I've got the right background, so that I don't have to go and re-enter all of my data. I don't have to provide you with all of my licenses, my registration details. You sort of have all of those and access to all of that information. And there's a data privacy aspect. And I think there's a culture around data privacy which government or agencies overstate. I think, if you talk to citizens, the concerns around big data and big government and big brother, I think, are a little bit overstated. I think most people would sacrifice a little bit of that in order to be able to have more efficient services and gain some time. So for me, it really is about how do I make sure that I've got the right data? How do I know the person? What are some of and then how do I then target the right services at the right time for them? So it's not about how do I know if somebody is driving who's been disqualified, banned from driving. How do I know that in advance? Can I tell that they're on the road? What's the other data that I can do that? If I've got people who've caused serious accidents who seem to be driving again, how again can I stop those? Because then you're getting into preventative measures, and there's lots of data sources that you're able to pull in order to do that. And that's the essence for me around this next wave of transformation. It's not about predictive analytics, but it's about grouping all of those data and being able to sort of tell you that there is a problem and an outcome. A large part, people are worried that means that you're replacing humans. I always view it as you need to augment humans. So it's about making sure that you're providing a range of options to human beings who are actually then having the interactions, who are making the decisions, but don't have them try and sift through mountains of data. We've got machines that can do that. They can provide them with options and do all of those things. So if you can deliver those much more efficient services, much more personalized to the individual, I think that's what citizens are really looking for. So speed, efficiency, personalization, but it's about how do you deliver those.
Fantastic. And I think you nailed it in the last sentence there. It's really about the focus on a mindset for building something that is far more efficient, so that then resources are focused on building more things that are more efficient. So it's not necessarily replacing people, it's actually replacing the things that they're spending time doing, it sounds like. Fantastic. Look, really enjoyed this conversation about some of the big issues and processes and approaches, mindsets as well, in terms of digital transformation in the emergency services context. But I think what you've given us really is is the approach to take, and an understanding that digital transformation is more than just adopting new technology. It's really a much deeper set of insights and mindset to achieve. Quite a lot of complexity involved there. Sounds like there's a lot of leadership involved as well. So thank you very much for this these insights shared. So that wraps up our chat about digital transformation from an emergency services context. Thanks, John.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.